Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me. I brought my own technology, which I'm delighted to say actually worked well. Yeah, if I can just give you, I realise, of course, even though this is billed as a keynote, I'm actually the warm-up act for that which is to follow, for the headline speakers and who are going to be much more technical than I'm going to be. What I'm going to try and do, though, is to encourage a certain amount of discussion and debate in a wider review and thinking about standards, but also public sector catering in general. As Mike said, I've been around for a long time. I'm not quite at the grumpy old man stage, but I'm getting pretty close. And I lived through and worked through and was a significant part of an earlier period in public sector catering when words like market testing, things like contracting out, were actually things that I was dealing with at the highest level on a daily basis. And I will just draw on one or two of our reflections about that, because I'm going to suggest to you that those types of pressures have been around for quite a long time. They just vary slightly depending upon time. I'm going to look at a number of what one might consider to be slightly left field approaches to standards, and in particular to try and draw your attention to the one area of standards in public sector in catering that I think we actually miss somewhat and we avoid probably at our peril. And I'm going to take the opportunity right at the very end of that to proffer some advice. But I'd like to start then with what I'm going to talk about. And the first question that you're bound to ask yourself is to say, well, what the hell is he talking about with a motorbike? Well, I happen to be passionate about motorbikes, and wherever I possibly can, I try and introduce them into presentations for a number of different reasons. And I could bore you silly about my time recently on the Isle of Man at the Grand Prix, but I won't do that. But I'm going to draw an analogy between this particular motorbike and how I see public sector, the public sector catering, from a slightly external position at the moment. Now, I see it that what's happened in the public sector and why I see a very strong similarity with this particular motorbike is this. That bike is stripped down and carries no baggage. It's highly manoeuvrable. It has to be. It has to be very manoeuvrable so it can avoid pitfalls. It's quite good at U-turns, actually, although you have to make sure you maintain your balance. It's actually very good at weaving in and out of things. It's very good in terms of accelerating from standing starts, and it has to be extremely good at coming to sudden halts. And that was part of my life when I was a public sector caterer. We were manoeuvring around in a way that most people wouldn't have believed. It's a highly efficient and tuned machine, and it has been for some considerable time. You've had to make it more efficient. We've had to tune it because of the pressures that have actually been on us during that particular period. We cannot carry passengers. We can't afford to carry passengers. There's no seat for carrying a passenger for a start, but we don't have the luxury of carrying passengers in what we do. Everything that we do has to be geared in a very efficient and very tuned way. However, it needs an experienced rider. Bikes like that, if you've never ridden a bike before, you'd be guaranteed to come off. But that's also true if you're a public sector caterer. You need experience to understand the nuances, but you also need to understand the pressures that you're operating under and how you can make your way through what can be a little bit of a minefield. The danger with bikes like this as well is that you can lose control when the external environment changes. All of a sudden it rains. You come across a slippery patch in the road. You try and park in a gravel car park, which, if you've ridden a motorbike, you'll understand what I'm talking about. All these things mean that you actually have to be very careful about how you're controlling the bike. And I'm going to suggest to you that as public sector caterers, we need to be very careful how we actually take the machine that we have now and how we move it into the future. Because what I've seen in my career as a caterer, which started a long time ago when that's actually a Triumph Bonneville, that's a much older bike than the one that I've shown you earlier, but one of the things that we started to see in my career, which for those of you who might not be able to read the bottom line, goes from 1970 until today. We've actually seen a number of changes, and we've seen a lot of different types of pressures on us throughout that entire period, most of which, of course, have been financial pressures. And in that respect, what we're experiencing now is slightly different, but I see it as part of an evolutionary process, not a revolutionary process. And you can learn an awful lot within your own particular fields by looking back at the way that some of the other public sector caterers had to respond to similar sets of initiatives in the past. So that we end up with a much leaner machine, a much more developed machine than we actually had over 40 years ago. So what are these pressures that we're finding on the public sector? And how does that relate to my concept and notion about evolution, evolutionary change? Well, I draw on a quote from one of the management gurus of the day, which I first used in 1985, which was, "The only stability is stability in motion. If you're not actually constantly moving forward, then you either fall over, as you do on a motorbike, or you go backwards, which you can't do on a motorbike." But so that as caterers, we have to recognise the environment that we're operating in. We have to be constantly aware of that external environment. We have to modify what we're doing in relation to that environment in order to stay upright, to stay secure, and actually to take the opportunity of moving the business and the activity forward. Now, I'm sure some of you have actually seen this fairly recently in the present financial climate. Not only does it appear in most headlines, some of you may have received emails recently, or indeed letters, saying exactly the same thing, the dreaded opening phase. That cartoon was taken from Soldier magazine in the mid-80s, when the whole business of looking at market testing, marketability, contracting out was actually very present in the mind, certainly in the context of the Ministry of Defence. We didn't actually get to the line of having Coca-Cola or Tesco sponsoring our tanks, but that seemed to be the general emphasis of where the whole issue about market testing was going. We also had problems, of course, in terms of understanding and discussing budgets, budgetary responsibilities, and some of the main issues around sharing out scarce resources. And that particular cartoon, for those who can't read it, it says at the bottom, "Conference day is always a bit fraught," because the number of senior staff who were constantly throwing their teddy bears into the corner and saying, "We can't do this. If I don't get this, I'm not going to be able to do that." I would suggest to you, throwing your teddy bear in the corner is actually not a very good idea. Not only do you lose the teddy bear, but you tend to lose an awful lot of credibility along the way. When you're fighting a battle, you need to know which the battle is that you really need to fight. And by throwing your teddy bear in the corner sometimes, you actually make yourself look rather foolish. But nevertheless, I can understand where that's coming from. This cartoon was from 1983. Things do change, but we can still significantly learn from the past. For those that might be able to not read that, it says, well, there was a light at the end of the tunnel, but as an economy measure, we've turned it off. And I'm sure some of you are feeling a bit like that at the moment. So if I want to look particularly at the notion of standards as far as public sector caterers are concerned, but I want to look at it in a social and political context. And I'll explain why as we go through. If we think first of all about the way that currently society and individuals think about food and they think about catering. And what I've tried to do is to take what I think might be out there in terms of the public perception of these things and try and summarise them into very small, simple bullet points. First of all, food now is very, very readily available. We don't actually have to work very hard for it. In fact, we don't physically work hard for our food at all.